So okay, we can start. So about this book, China and Islam. By the way, just to start with, I was impressed by the book and the way you tackled the issue. Having been trained in law and then as an anthropologist, my first question, as it was for the colleagues, is why and how did you come to study China and Islam in China? What was your impetus and what was the motivation?
So, thank you for the question, Tariq. It's a bit of a long story, but the short version is after college, I ended up volunteering in South Asia, and the impetus there was that I studied medieval English epic poetry in college, and I realized that I omitted this huge part of the world, which was Asia. And so I decided that I needed to go and to experience it myself, and so I ended up in India volunteering in Dharamsala with the Tibet government in exile. And I got very interested in the Tibet question through that experience, but I wanted to understand the Chinese side of the argument. I guess I was thinking like a lawyer. And so I ended up moving to China, living in China for several years, studying Chinese in Beijing. And in China, I feel like there's a kind of random allotment of sort of experiences that somehow lead you to a certain path. And my landlord was a very jovial Han Chinese man whose best friend was a Hui, a Chinese Muslim. And I met every Saturday with his Hui friend, teacher Feng Laoshi. And he turned out to be this extraordinary person who, during the Cultural Revolution, fled China to Japan, where he studied Japanese, Chomskyan grammar, and converted to Christianity. And yet he was still a Hui. Ethnically he was Hui, and yet he believed in Jesus. And so this man was absolutely fascinating. And so I said, we met every Saturday to talk about Muhammad, Jesus, and Chomsky. And he said, if you really want to understand Muslims in China, you have to go out west. And so I did. Go west, young man. And I started traveling, backpacking out to Qinghai, Ningxia, Gansu, and Xinjiang. And that's when I really kind of got hooked on this question. And so I practiced law in Beijing in 2007, 2008, and I got introduced to the world of law in China, and really the center of the project then is to try to understand how law operates in Chinese society. There's a long-standing view in the literature that China has no law, right? So going back to Marcel Granet, who wrote that the Chinese never thought of the idea of law, that's not the case. And so we have law and sort of positive law, the law from the state, but then religious law. And I ended up focusing on the relationship between the two.
Thank you. Just a question about the title, because you decided to put China and Islam. And when we read the book, it's clear that there is something which we can call a reality of Chinese Muslims or Islam in China. And it's as if you are talking about two different realities, it's China and Islam. Why have you decided to put it that way, while the substance of the book is exactly the opposite? You are in fact advocating the opposite. So there is no real contradiction between the two dimensions. Or at least it's possible for Muslims to find their way within the Chinese context.
That's correct. So there's perhaps no inherent contradiction, and yet there are tensions. Which I try to express and describe ethnographically. The original title was actually The Prophet and the Party, editorial decision to change it.
Okay.
And so, in the introduction, I talk about how we're no longer in this clash of civilizations mode, and so I quickly, want to make sure that the reader is aware that I'm not coming from that kind of perspective. But I just want to take a step back and explain a little bit more about the question of Muslims in China. So oftentimes what we hear of in places like England and the US is the Uyghurs, the Turkic Muslims, right? This is our sort of media impression, this is what we hear about. And oftentimes there are the stories of violence and interethnic conflict and blood and gore. So that's one kind of theater, that's one sort of set of relationships. I focus on the Hui, who are kind of the majority minority amongst Muslims in China. There's over 10 million, who have a much different history in China than the Uyghurs do, right? So the Hui believe that they're the descendants of the original Arab and Persian merchants, missionaries, and envoys who entered China about a century after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, blessings be upon him, and that they have inherited this sort of tradition, right? And so they, over the centuries, have adapted to the reality of living in China, and nevertheless, it's one that at times has led to conflicts with the Han majority. I mean, there are stories that we know of from the Qing dynasty, for example, where there were absolute tensions between the groups, and a lot of them center around things like food, right, which seems very mundane, banal, but actually goes to the center of a lot of concerns for purity amongst Muslims. And of course, Han Chinese famously put pork in almost everything they eat, and so stories of Han Chinese lopping off heads of pigs and throwing them into mosque grounds and that sort of thing. And so there's one element of sort of social discrimination. So that's one aspect of it. The other is, the other question is whether or not the state has institutionalized discrimination. And the Qing did have they issued laws that were against, for example, intermarriage between Han and non-Han groups that increased penalties and penal law for Hui, for Muslims. And this is a kind of a reality that the communists, the current regime, are very aware of. And that picture is even more complicated in terms of whether or not there's institutionalized state discrimination. The state has made bold efforts to create opportunities for all minorities. There's preferential policies in terms of education, employment, these sort of things. But at the same time, there is a concern increasingly post 9/11 of infiltration by extremist Muslim groups. And so to give you one kind of concrete data point, I've been tracking this story the last couple of months to go back to the question of food, halal food, where the head of the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, which is one of the bureaus in charge of minority affairs in China, was a Hui who was pushing for halal food legislation. Right, so there's a number of local regulations that govern this question, but no sort of nationwide law. And it seemed to have real traction. The government was actually really considering this. There was a large number of debates that went to the highest levels of government, that some meetings that even Xi Jinping was attending. And yet, ultimately, it seemed like Wang, his name is Mr. Wang, who's the head of this commission, was pushing too hard for this law, and he was actually taken out of power and replaced by somebody who was more loyal to kind of the party ideal of what minorities should be doing. So there's a real tension here. We see that there are limits that the Hui are always kind of pushing up against. And so I approach that question more ethnographically through my experience in Linxia, which is a famous town, famous amongst the Hui, a town in Gansu province.
Yes, so I have a question about this, because in what you are saying, for example, you are comparing very often what is happening in the West, saying it's quite different in China, and you are referring and saying, for example, after 2009, was what happened with the Uyghur, sorry for the pronunciations of the Chinese words, but this is where there are suspicions, and it's to be a suspected Chinese citizen. At the same time, people, and you listen to the Chinese, and you are talking about the fact that they are Chinese, they speak Mandarin, they are part of the society, and still there is a suspicion, and this suspicion is not new, it's not coming after 2009, it's a very old reality within China. So what, and then you are saying, for centuries, or at least during the last, they have been able to deal in the informal space between the state party law and what we still speak about Islamic law and Islamic ethics, and I will come to this with the next question. But what is the main problem here when it comes to, is it because the perception is Islamic law is not compatible, or is it because there is a threat, or a threat understood as this Muslim presence within the society?
Yeah. So I think,
yes, I'm asking this question because this is the parallel that we can make also with the Western Muslims that you are making very often.
Okay, so there's many questions there, but let me try to pull them apart. I think on the one hand, in the book, I'm trying to bring the China case into dialogue with what's happening in the West, right? Conversations about Muslims in Europe and North America and elsewhere, because the Muslims in China are often seen as sort of this aberrational, kind of way far off, sort of distinct minority. And I think that's unfair. I think there are commonalities, and I think there are opportunities to create comparisons, and hopefully that's fruitful. But at the same time, I do recognize that the China experience is distinct in its own way. So you have this very long history of adaptation and acculturation that the Hui have experienced. They're not recent immigrants to the country, certainly. They're very proud of the fact that they're Chinese, the Hui at least, and they have a kind of canon of texts that they often refer to, the so-called Han Kitab, Han meaning Chinese and Kitab meaning book in Arabic. That is a set of texts that were produced by Hui scholars such as Liu Zhi, 18th century intellectual, and the traditionalists. So I haven't even started talking about the different groups amongst Hui, but there's these different, what are called Jiao Pai, which could be translated as teaching schools, but the traditionalist ones, they refer to this constantly in their sermons, in their discussions, in their debates, and in their conflicts. So there's certainly an affinity with China culturally, linguistically, and what have you. But the other point of distinction here is, of course, is the political system, right? So we have a lot of the literature discussing about the relationship between Muslim minorities and Western liberal states, right? So multi-party democracies. China is very different in that regard, okay? And so the key question the book examines is how can Hui abide by Sharia in a system that does not formally recognize it. Now, you could say, well, the UK is a system that does not formally recognize Sharia, right? The state law does not recognize it, and yet you have a very robust civil society here, right? You have Sharia councils, you have religious arbitration that takes care of commercial matters. You have a mayor who's Muslim, right? I mean, I'm waiting for that to happen in Beijing. In China, you don't have a civil society that is trying to protect and foster the rights and interests of Muslims. That has been more or less kind of monopolized by the state. And that's why they go to, the term is minjian, which means, it's translated as unofficial or popular. Literally it means person to person, within people. And it's in that space of the minjian that they are able to abide by their law. So it's outside the formal system, outside what's formally created by the state and its various institutions, judicial and otherwise, but rather it's through these spaces, for example, in mosques, where the clerics, the ahong as they're called in Chinese, after the hun, where they are taking on disputes and mediating them in accordance with Sharia.
So there is a question here about the reference to Sharia, because you are talking about the legal system, but at the same time you are saying Sharia could be understood as an ethical reference by some, and it is, in fact, very often there. At the same time, the parallel with the West is that there is no institution, there are no institutions between the state and the individual, so there is this is what you are saying in the book, is that it's much more, as what you were explaining now, it's finding in the informal space a way of dealing with this. The question here is, you start by saying, there is a problem in defining, are we talking about Islamic law or not? And at the same time saying, coming from the state, there is an acceptance of what we call in the West, freedom of conscience and freedom of worship. When it comes to ibadat, for example, that they can pray and that they can fast and that they can, all this is fine. When it comes to the ibadat, the transaction, interpersonal relationship, mu'amalat, yes. When it comes to the mu'amalat, this is where, with the state, there is a power struggle, and this is why it's interesting that you're referring to two traditions, the Foucault tradition with grandeur mentality, and at the same time Weber, when he was the Weberian definition of law, how we work. So at the end, the whole discussion is about a power relationship, or it's about reference, it's about law, and my final question, because there are two questions here, the final question is, if at the end, the Chinese Muslims are referring to Sharia as an ethical system, is this going to work? Is this the way forward? Or, and to avoid the legal reference? or is it pushing too much?
Yeah. So I can approach that from kind of the Hui perspective, and so the Hui would say that Sharia, which they call Jiao Fa, which literally means their religious law. So they use the Chinese term Fa. They do not use the Chinese term Li, which could be translated as rights or etiquette, right? And in Chinese legal history, you have this, kind of contrast between the Fa and the Li. They distinctly refer to it as the law. So in their mind, it has a kind of ontological status as law. Now, having said that, if you observe the kind of Jiao Fa, religious law that they often cite and refer to, it is ethical. So there's a great deal of ethical content, all right? So where is the law? Well, the law resides in for example, the rules to establish a waqf, a pious endowment, in the mandatory Quranic shares of inheritance, in the rule that the husband must provide the mahar, the bridal gift to the bride. So there are legalistic rules on the one hand, and yet certainly there is a lot of ethical guidance that Sharia provides them in terms of their own personal behavior, their relationship to God, but also how they relate to other people, right? So they think of it as a way to orchestrate their own behavior vis-a-vis others in their community and then beyond their community as well, and also in regards to Han Chinese to some extent. So it involves both aspects. Now, you're right to point out the difference between the al-adat, which is the devotional side of the law, at least in the Hanafi jurisprudence, and most of the Muslims in China they adhere to the Hanafi school, versus the muamalat. So China, in its formal legal system, provides for religious freedom. There is freedom of religion, and the actual wording says there's freedom to believe and freedom not to believe. Okay? And this has been interpreted as a kind of separation of church and state of sorts in China. Now, the issue there is that you have the formal law from the state, but then you have the party rules. And the book also tries to examine the party as a kind of, as a sort of a secular entity that has its own rules that more sharply conflicts with Sharia, right? So a lot of the Hui that I engage with are both cadres, they're members of the Communist Party, but they're pious Muslims. And so the question then is, how do they reconcile these two very different selves? But the party rules often trump the law in determining that question of religious freedom. What is religion? And what are the limits of freedom? And so that's the real push when it comes to the muamalat. So they're not allowed to, for example, write contracts in accordance with Sharia. That would be impermissible. That wouldn't be enforced by a court to be more concrete. And nevertheless, what you have now with this incredible religious revival, not just Islam, but Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, etc., in China is more interaction with co-religionists abroad. And this has transactional dimensions to it. And so the real challenge, I think, for the state, we haven't talked about the challenge for the Hui, but the challenge for the party state is how to reconcile their need to increasingly interact with Central Asia, the Middle East. You have all of these multinational organizations now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You have this One Belt, One Road, which is a massive project investing $46 billion in this corridor with Pakistan. So you have all this interaction, and yet not allowing any kind of aspect of Sharia in the transactional sphere. The Hui are very active, though, through this Minjian dimension, the unofficial, and they are actually creating their own financial and charitable instruments that are in accordance with Sharia. So to go back to the last question, which is how, what is the future for Hui? Is it to make Sharia more ethical and less legal? I think it's constantly this process of adaptation to the reality, to the social and political reality. And so I don't think that they're giving up on those legal dimensions, transactional, commercial, and what have you. In fact, they may be more prominent in the years ahead. But certainly I think in the mosques, what I see is that there is an ethicized version of Sharia that is very much emphasized by the leadership.
Quite quickly, my last question about it, because the last point is very important. It also has a sort of 23 million of Chinese Muslims, and 10 millions are coming from the Uyghur and the Hai. And you in your book you are saying they are influencing the culture there. There is an influence of the Muslim presence there, and there is an influence from the environment, the Chinese environment, on Muslims.
Yeah.
So in which way you see this operating, and in which way this is critical when it comes to all the discussion, law, ethics, but also the power relationship that we have over there.
Right, so it's definitely multi-directional and they're influencing each other, there's no question about it. I mean, the role of the Hui in Northwest China historically has been absolutely paramount to the relationship between the state and the population. Without going into too much detail, there's no question that the so-called Ma family warlords set the tone for how the state is now interacting with minorities in that region, and the influence impacts every aspect of Hui. So they have been influenced, for example, by Taoism and Buddhism. There's no question about the Sufis in particular. There's a real inheritance, and there's a thick kind of exchange of ideas there. The Salafis are more resistant to accepting any kind of Chinese influence, and that then goes back to this idea that there's a sort of a spectrum of these teaching schools in terms of how Chinese they are. But we definitely get versions of a very Chinese Islam according to individual Hui or collective Hui's sense of their own doctrinal affiliations. So it's a very complicated picture indeed.
Okay.